This Russian family lived isolated from all human contact for 4 decades. Their story's insane. You can watch all the watchJojo videos on your big screen TV via our dedicated Roku, FireTV, Android TV, and Apple TV apps. There, in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, they came across a family. And not just any family, this was a family of hermits. A family, in fact, who had apparently lived cut off from the rest of the world since before the start of World War II. For more than 40 years, the Lykov family had survived in an area better known for wolves and bears than it is for humans. But even more astonishing than their discovery is the story of how they got there and how they stayed alive in a place where death is a constant companion. It was in 1978 that a group of geologists were surveying an area to the south of Taiga, close to the border of Mongolia, in a helicopter. The team were searching for a safe landing area, and that's when they spotted a vision that simply astounded them. In particular, on the side of the mountain, the geologists saw a garden. At first, though, they weren't sure what it was, partly because it was such a shocking sight. They flew past a number of times. After multiple passes, however, they reached the conclusion that there, 6,000 feet up high on the side of a peak, were signs of human life. And after the crew had reported back to their team on the ground, a decision was made. The geologists would go make the trek up the mountain and try to make contact with whoever was living there. Still, they had reason to worry. As Russian journalist Vasily Peskov once noted, bumping into a stranger in the taiga could be far more dangerous than bumping into a wild animal. So a party of 4 made the arduous journey to the position highlighted by the pilots. They took gifts with them, unsure of the reception they'd receive if they found anyone around the garden. And the closer they got to the area, the clearer the signs of life became. For example, the team discovered a simple path cut into the dirt. Then they spotted both a walking stick and a log, the latter used as a crossing point in a stream. Finally, the team came across a shack that contained a stock of dried potatoes. They knew they were almost at the garden, and that's when they saw the wooden hut that the Lykovs had called home for 40 years. The hut was clearly handmade, and its timber had turned black through weather and decay. But there, perched on the side of the mountain, was a dwelling that people had called home for 4 decades. And the first inhabitant they met looked like he'd been pulled from the pages of a storybook. It was Karp Lykov, and the geologists were the first people he'd had contact with, other than his direct family, since he first went into the wilderness so many years earlier. But despite some initial trepidation, he eventually invited them inside his makeshift home. It was actually 1936 when Karp Lykov led his family into the taiga, after his brother was shot and killed by Soviet guards. As a result, then, Lykov took his wife Akulina and their 2 children, Savin and Natalia, to what he saw as safety. At around 150 miles away from the closest inhabited area, they made their home. Later, while the family lived outside of society, Akulina gave birth to 2 more children. Dmitry was born in 1940, while the Lykovs' youngest daughter, Agafia, was born in 1943. The children taught themselves to read and write using prayer books and a copy of the Bible. But as you might imagine, life in the frozen wilderness was not without its hardships and tragedies. The Lykovs lived off a diet of vegetables they grew in the garden, berries they could forage, and animals they could catch. Dmitry evolved into an expert hunter, stalking the woods in his bare feet to provide for his family. But food wasn't always plentiful, and in the late 50s, the family were facing a famine. In 1961, moreover, the snow fell in June, leaving the family desperate. The starving Lykovs were forced to consume bark and even their own shoes. Rather than seeing their children suffer, though, Akulina refused food. Tragically, as a result, she later passed away through starvation. But that same year, what the family considered to be a miracle happened. A solitary rye grain began to grow in the garden. They tended it day and night to ensure that it wasn't eaten by mice or other animals. And from that one grain of rye, they gathered 18 more. The family then used these to slowly regrow their crop. The Lykovs were, as you might imagine, a hardy bunch, but the geologists who found them discovered that they were intelligent. To begin with, for example, Karp would not take gifts that the scientists offered. Eventually, however, he accepted some salt, even though it had been more than 40 years since the mineral passed his lips. And while the geologists described the living conditions of the family as medieval, Karp in particular was quick to learn about the modern outside world. Indeed, although he wouldn't believe that man had reached the moon, he soon understood what satellites were, having watched them in the night sky since the 50s. Sadly though, in 1981, just 3 years after the geologists first made contact with the Lykov family, 3 of the children died. Only Karp and his daughter Agafya were in the hut, and despite being offered a home in a nearby village numerous times, they chose instead to remain with the life they knew. In February 1988 though, Karp died as well. Incredibly, it was 27 years to the day since his wife had passed away, and he was buried on the mountainside next to the graves of his children. Agafya was left alone in the mountains then, the last survivor of a family who had lived out the majority of their existence away from the comings and goings of the world. And more than 25 years later, Agafya still lives in the woods, alone, eking out the only living she's ever known. Here is a septuagenarian woman who's remained untouched by the great events of the last century. What's more, upon learning of them, she simply shrugged her shoulders and headed back to her shack in the mountains. We imagine she'll remain there until the bitter end. Please don't forget to share this story with your friends below.